Meaning, Knowledge and Reality by John McDowell. Quotes. Meaning, Knowledge and Reality by John McDowell is a collection of essays exploring central topics in philosophy, focusing on how meaning connects to our understanding of reality and knowledge. McDowell critically engages with theories of language, reference, and epistemology, drawing on figures like Frege, Wittgenstein, and others to develop his view of how our linguistic and cognitive capacities enable us to navigate and interpret the world meaningfully. By examining debates about realism, anti-realism, and the role of perception in acquiring knowledge, McDowell presents a nuanced philosophical framework that challenges reductionist approaches and emphasizes the irreducibility of meaning and intentionality. If, quote 1, if there can be such a thing as a theory of meaning for a language, meaning cannot be anything but what any such theory is a theory of. This statement emphasizes the notion that if we attempt to develop a theory of meaning for a language, then meaning itself must be understood through that theory. The explanation suggests that such a theory should not rely on preconceived ideas about meaning, but should instead clarify the nature of meaning through its structure and application. The quote underscores the need to define meaning in a way that is logically consistent within the confines of the theoretical framework. Quote 2. Tarski's work shows how theories of truth, conforming to the above schematic description of a Fregean theory of sense, may be constructed for certain sorts of formalized languages. This highlights Tarski's significant contribution to constructing theories of truth within the framework of formalized languages, aligning with Frege's approach to sense. The quote illustrates how Tarski's methods offer a way to systematize the connection between truth and linguistic structure in formal languages, paving the way for a more rigorous understanding of meaning through the truth-conditional framework. Quote 3. The thesis should be, not that sense is what a theory of truth is a theory of, but rather that truth is what a theory of sense is a theory of. This challenges a common assumption by proposing that instead of defining sense as a subset of truth theory, we should consider truth to be an outcome of a theory of sense. The explanation suggests that understanding meaning, sense, leads to an understanding of truth, thereby placing the theory of sense at the foundational level rather than the theory of truth. Quote 4. Adherence to the principle of bivalence, even in the presence of undecidable sentences, is, according to Dummett, characteristic of realism. Here, the focus is on Dummett's perspective that realism is tied to the principle of bivalence, the idea that every sentence is either true or false, even when a sentence's truth value cannot be determined. This reflects a deeper philosophical debate about whether truths exist independently of our ability to verify them, distinguishing realist views from verificationist or anti-realist perspectives. Quote 5. Assertions are made only in languages, and what, if anything, is asserted by uttering a sentence cannot diverge from what would be said about the sentence by a systematic theory for the language that contains it. This statement asserts the close relationship between language, assertion, and systematic theories of meaning. It implies that an assertion's content is dependent on the structure provided by the language and cannot deviate from it. The explanation reflects the idea that the act of making an assertion is intrinsically tied to the underlying rules and system of the language in use, reinforcing the importance of a cohesive theoretical framework in understanding language. Quote 6. Absence of decisive evidence does not block understanding, and understanding is thought of, here too, as knowledge of a truth condition. This quote reflects the idea that a lack of conclusive evidence does not prevent someone from understanding a concept or a statement. In this context, understanding is equated with knowing the conditions under which a statement would be true, even if the actual truth cannot be determined with the available evidence. The notion emphasizes the separation between understanding a sentence's meaning and being able to verify its truth in practice. Quote 7. A theory of truth must interact with a theory of force for the language in question. This quote highlights that a theory of truth cannot stand alone, but must work in conjunction with a theory that explains how language is used to perform actions, such as making assertions or asking questions. This interaction ensures that the truth of sentences is tied to their practical use in communication, making it essential to understand how linguistic expressions relate to actions and intentions. Quote 8. Assertion is not a casually observable phenomenon, correctly describable wherever it occurs, independently of the construction of a systematic theory for the language in which it is occurring. This statement suggests that assertion, or the act of making a statement, is not something that can be easily understood without a structured, systematic theory of the language in which it happens. It implies that language and assertions are deeply interconnected, and that to truly comprehend what someone is asserting, we need a comprehensive theory that explains the language's rules and conventions. Quote 9. In acquiring mastery of his language, the native speaker had nothing more to go on than encouragement and discouragement of his vocalizings in observable circumstances. This quote explains the process by which a native speaker learns their language through feedback, positive reinforcement for correct usage, and correction for errors, based on observable situations. The idea is that language acquisition, at its core, depends on interaction with the environment and social feedback, rather than an innate understanding of abstract concepts like truth or meaning. Quote 10. From the standpoint of a strong verificationist, then, the only hygienic concept of meaning would be something like Quine's concept of stimulus meaning. This quote underscores a strong verificationist view, which holds that meaning should be grounded solely in observable behavior and responses to stimuli, aligning with Quine's idea of stimulus meaning. According to this perspective, meaning cannot involve abstract, unobservable concepts, but must be tied to concrete, observable situations, suggesting a more empirical and behaviorist approach to understanding language. Quote 11. According to theorists of communication intention, we should explain what meaning is in terms of the audience-directed intentions of speakers. This quote introduces the view that meaning in communication is derived from the intentions a speaker has toward their audience. The theorists argue that the act of speaking involves more than just the words themselves. It also includes the intention behind them, aiming to convey a certain message to the listener. Understanding meaning, therefore, requires paying attention to these communicative intentions and how they are directed toward the audience. Quote 12. We still cannot be satisfied that we have an adequate general account of the notion of meaning unless we are satisfied that we have an adequate general understanding of the notion of truth. This highlights the relationship between meaning and truth. It suggests that a comprehensive understanding of meaning in language is tied to our understanding of truth. Specifically, it is not enough to define meaning solely in terms of how words are used or understood. We must also explore how those words relate to truth, whether what is being said corresponds to reality or fact. Quote 13. To determine the meaning of an indicative sentence is to determine what statement can be made by uttering it, and that is just to determine what belief the sentence can be used to get audiences to think the speaker has. This quote emphasizes that the meaning of a sentence is intertwined with the belief it conveys. When a speaker makes a statement, they are not only sharing information, but also shaping the audience's understanding of their own beliefs. The meaning of a sentence is thus closely linked to the way it influences the audience's perception of the speaker's mindset or beliefs. Quote 14. What is special about someone who does understand the language is that his sensory intake yields him, in addition, knowledge as to what speech acts, with what content are being performed. Here, the text discusses the unique ability of language speakers to interpret not just the sounds they hear, but also the meaning behind them. Someone who understands a language can grasp the intent and content of speech acts beyond the mere perception of sounds, indicating that comprehension goes beyond the physical input to include cognitive interpretation and contextual knowledge. Quote 15. It seems that one cannot get it across that P if it is not the case that P. This quote reflects a logical point about communication. You cannot successfully communicate or convey something as true unless it is actually true. The effectiveness of communication, especially in conveying facts, relies on the truth of the statement being shared. If the underlying proposition is false, then the communication itself fails to achieve its intended purpose of sharing knowledge. Quote 16. Such capacities obviously have survival value. Similar survival value would attach also to any behavioral disposition whose effect was to spread, among several individuals, the beneficial results of one individual's exercises of its perceptual capacities. This quote describes how certain perceptual abilities, such as recognizing predators or dangers, have clear survival value for animals. Additionally, behaviors that allow one individual's perceptual experiences to benefit others, such as warning signals, also provide survival advantages. These shared behaviors, in a sense, communicate important information that helps others in the group avoid danger, emphasizing the evolutionary significance of communication as a survival tool. Quote 17. The appropriate mutual awareness is awareness that the speaker has indeed said such and such to the audience. Here, the focus is on the nature of communication in linguistic exchanges, particularly how mutual awareness plays a crucial role. It explains that for communication to be successful, both the speaker and the audience must be aware that the intended message has been shared. This mutual awareness forms the foundation of effective communication, ensuring that the speaker's intention has been recognized by the audience. Quote 18. The intention to make such an intention public is the intention to let an audience know what speech act is being performed. This highlights the concept that speech acts in communication are not just about conveying information, but also about making the speaker's intentions public. By making these intentions clear, the speaker ensures that the audience understands not just the content of the message, but also the type of communicative act being performed. This public display of intent is essential in defining the nature of speech acts and communication. Quote 19. If someone knows that P and says that P, then typically someone who hears and understands him is in a position to know that P. This statement reflects the idea that when someone asserts a fact that they know to be true, and the audience understands the assertion, the audience can also come to know that fact. This concept underscores the epistemic function of language, where communication serves as a means of transferring knowledge from one person to another, assuming the truth of the original assertion. Quote 20. The possession of content, on the part of pieces of behavior of the relevant kind, can in turn account for the fact that they become capable of being taken as expressive of belief when the individual's dealings with the repertoire become self-conscious. This quote explains how communicative behaviors, which initially might not involve self-consciousness or belief expression, can evolve into more complex expressions of belief as individuals become more self-aware in their use of language. It suggests that as communication becomes more intentional, the behaviors that once simply transmitted information can also convey the speaker's beliefs about the world. Quote 21. Davidson's theory is beautiful and illuminating. Perhaps there are difficulties in its further elaboration, but this essay will not criticize it on this or any other score. This quote acknowledges the elegance and depth of Davidson's theory. Its complexity may lead to potential challenges when expanding on it. The author chooses not to critique Davidson's theory in this instance, but recognizes that elaborating on such theories often brings up difficulties that are natural to complex philosophical ideas. Quote 22. At the second stage, it is claimed that 2 is vulnerable to a possible indeterminacy of truth value over and above anything that affects Ita 1. This statement points out that a more elaborate version of the proposal could face an issue where truth value becomes indeterminate, meaning it is not clear whether the statement is true or false. This indeterminacy goes beyond what was initially problematic, introducing another layer of complexity in evaluating the truth of the statement. Quote 23. What seems plausible, however, is this. The appropriate mutual awareness is actually what is aimed at by the speaker's primary communicative intention, so that securing the mutual awareness is not, as in Strawson's picture, a fallible means to communicative success, but rather constitutes it. This quote explains that mutual awareness between speaker and audience is not just a tool for successful communication, as Strawson suggests, but is the very essence of successful communication. If both parties recognize the intention behind the communication, this mutual recognition itself ensures that communication has taken place, making it fundamental rather than a side effect. Quote 24. We might plausibly say that actual occurrence is to concrete particular events what actual existence is to material objects. This analogy compares events to material objects, stating that just as material objects are said to exist when they physically occupy space, events can be considered to occur when they take place in reality. This statement draws attention to the nature of events and existence in the context of philosophical discussions about language and truth. Quote 25. Frege's response is to abandon the assumption that the expressions of the content sentence have their usual semantic role. This quote highlights Frege's approach to resolving a problem in which the meaning of words within a sentence doesn't align with their typical semantic roles. By rejecting the idea that expressions in a reported sentence function in their ordinary way, Frege aims to resolve certain philosophical challenges related to indirect discourse and language structure. Quote 26. This account treats quotation as a variant notation for spelling out the quoted material. This quote discusses an approach to quotation that sees it as merely a way of explicitly representing the quoted material, often by breaking it down into smaller components such as letters or phonemes. The explanation here suggests that, rather than being a distinct semantic tool, quotation can be viewed as a practical, notational method of referencing specific linguistic components. Quote 27. We can recognize that there are other ways in which the intention to quote is signaled. This quote emphasizes that quotation marks are not the only way to indicate that a quotation is being made. There are other contextual or linguistic cues that can serve the same purpose, signaling the intent to quote without necessarily using traditional quotation marks. This idea opens up a broader understanding of how quotations function in communication. Quote 28. If the identity of words depends on the identity of languages, then words become problematic as objects of reference. This highlights a critical issue in the philosophy of language regarding the reference of words. If a word's identity is tied to the specific language it belongs to, then it becomes difficult to talk about words across different languages or dialects without ambiguity. The problem lies in how to maintain consistency and clarity when referring to words that might have different meanings or uses in different linguistic contexts. Quote 29. The desirable distinction between quoting and mere reproduction is now located as a distinction between different sorts of predicate of utterances. Here, the text distinguishes between quoting and simply reproducing words. Quoting involves referencing specific utterances with a particular purpose, while reproduction can be seen as mechanically replicating the words without such an intent. This distinction is important in understanding how language functions differently depending on the speaker's communicative goal. Quote 30. Predications explicable in terms of the first relation are typical cases of quoting. Predications explicable in terms of the second are typical cases of reproduction. This quote clarifies that quoting and reproduction are governed by different types of relations. When quoting, the speaker's relationship to the original utterance is essential, while reproduction merely replicates the form of the words. The distinction lies in the speaker's intention and the context of usage, which defines whether they are quoting or reproducing words. Quote 31. We cannot first construct a theory about the conditions under which utterances are true, and then draw conclusions about what speakers are saying. Rather, we attempt to construct a truth characterization precisely with a view to the acceptability of using its specifications of truth conditions as specifications of what speakers are saying. This quote underscores the idea that theories of meaning or truth conditions are not developed in isolation from the act of interpretation itself. Instead, Such theories are created with the purpose of interpreting what speakers are saying in specific contexts. It emphasizes the interdependence between constructing theories of meaning and interpreting language, rejecting a one-directional approach. Quote 32. We can see that the problematic inferences need not have been expected to preserve truth, without being obliged to suppose that there is an intelligible same-saying relation of the kind that Quine doubts. This highlights the idea that Davidson's approach to indirect discourse and same-saying doesn't rely on the assumption that there is a single clear relation of same-saying that philosophers like Quine question. Rather, Davidson's method provides a way of understanding inferences in language without needing to invoke controversial ideas like propositions as shared objects of meaning. This opens the door to interpreting communication without getting bogged down in deeper metaphysical concerns. Quote 33. The point of the paratactic theory is that I cannot make an utterance of one without, in the course of doing so, making just such an utterance you. This quote explains that according to the paratactic theory, when one makes a report using indirect discourse, one inevitably produces the very utterance that the report attributes to the original speaker. In other words, while reporting someone else's statement, the speaker must also say the content of that statement in their own utterance, reinforcing the connection between the two speech acts. Quote 34. We are bound to go on asking questions like this. If an utterance of a certain sentence makes me a same-sayer with someone, why does an utterance of a sentence exactly like the first, except that it substitutes for one name another name of the same thing, not also make me a same-sayer with him? This captures the persistent philosophical puzzle regarding the relationship between names and meaning. It reflects the problem of why a slight variation in the wording of a sentence, such as using different names for the same referent, can result in a different interpretation or understanding, even though the referents are the same. The question challenges the idea that meaning is fully determined by reference alone, and points toward deeper issues about the significance of language and naming. Quote 35. On a paratactic account of quotation, there is no reason to say that quoted words are not uttered. This asserts that according to the paratactic view of quotation, when someone uses quotation marks, they are still speaking or uttering the words contained within the quotation. This challenges other theories that might see quoting as merely mentioning or referring to words without using them. In the paratactic view, quoting involves actively using the words, not just referring to them abstractly. Quote 36. A modest theory of meaning for a language is one that gives no account of the concepts expressed by primitive terms of the language. This quote defines a modest theory of meaning as one that does not attempt to explain the underlying concepts associated with basic or primitive terms in a language. Such a theory operates without delving into the deeper conceptual content of these terms, focusing instead on their use within the language. This approach contrasts with more ambitious theories that seek to explain or derive the meaning of even the most fundamental concepts in the language. Quote 37. Our interest, as theorists of meaning, is in specifications of the contents of actual and possible speech acts, specifications of the thoughts propounded in them. This quote highlights the focus of theorists of meaning on understanding the content of speech acts, including the thoughts they convey. The aim is to specify what is being communicated in these acts, regardless of the mode in which the thoughts are expressed. The theorist's goal is to capture the essence of the meaning conveyed in both actual and hypothetical uses of language. Quote 38. A proper theory of meaning for a language would be formulated as from outside content altogether. This statement discusses the requirement that a comprehensive theory of meaning should be formulated from a perspective outside of the actual content of the language it describes. The idea is that such a theory would not take the meanings of the terms and sentences for granted, but would instead provide an account that does not rely on the content of the language it aims to explain. This approach is part of the attempt to create a theory that can stand independently of the language's inherent concepts. Quote 39. If a theory is full-blooded with respect to a given concept, That means that it describes a practical capacity such that to acquire it would be to acquire the concept. This quote explains the idea of a full-blooded theory of meaning, which aims to describe the practical abilities required to use a concept, such that by acquiring those abilities, one would also acquire the concept itself. The theory does not merely define the concept abstractly, but links it to practical skills or behaviors, making the acquisition of the concept a matter of developing specific competencies. Quote 40. It is easy to interpret the claim as a form of behaviorism and accuse it of simply leaving out of account the involvement of mind in meaningful speech. This quote addresses a potential critique of Dummett's theory, suggesting that it might be misunderstood as a type of behaviorism. Behaviorism is the view that focuses purely on observable behavior and neglects the mental processes involved in language use. The concern here is that Dummett's approach, by focusing on external practices, could be seen as ignoring the mental states that contribute to the meaning of speech. Quote 41. The argument that connects modesty with the psychologistic conception of language as a code depends on the assumption that contents must be capturable as from outside. This quote emphasizes that the criticism linking modesty with the psychologistic view of language, which treats language as a code for conveying thought, hinges on the assumption that the content of language can be explained from an external perspective. The statement challenges the validity of this assumption and opens the door to understanding content as something internal to linguistic practice, not something that can be fully captured from an external viewpoint. Quote 42. Rejecting psychologism is taking the view that the senses of utterances are not hidden behind them, but lie open to view. That is, that to be a speaker of language is to be capable of putting one's thoughts into one's words, where others can hear or see them. This highlights the rejection of psychologism by asserting that meaning in language is not something hidden or internal, but something that is presented openly in the act of speaking. Understanding language involves perceiving thoughts directly in the words used, rather than interpreting them as hidden mental states. The focus is on the transparency of meaning in linguistic interactions. Quote 43. To accept modesty, by contrast, is to insist that the outward aspect of linguistic behavior is essentially content-involving, so that the mind's role in speech is, as it were, on the surface, part of what one presents to others, not something that is at best a hypothesis for them. This statement explains that accepting a modest theory of meaning involves recognizing that the outward aspects of speech inherently involve content. The role of the mind in communication is displayed openly in language, making meaning accessible to those who understand the language. This challenges views that treat meaning as hidden or speculative. Quote 44. We have to equip ourselves to see how our ability to have dealings with content can be not a mere natural endowment, but an achievement, which an individual attains by acquiring membership in a linguistic community. This quote reflects the idea that the ability to engage with content, meaning, and thought is not something humans are simply born with. Instead, it is an achievement that comes from participating in a linguistic community where language use enables individuals to express and understand complex ideas. The quote highlights the communal and developmental aspect of mastering content through language. Quote 45. The requirement of full-bloodedness, the idea that a language is fully characterizable as from outside content, looks like a typical piece of Enlightenment objectification. This statement criticizes the idea of full-bloodedness, the notion that language can be entirely described from an external perspective, as a product of Enlightenment thinking, which tends to objectify complex phenomena. It suggests that such objectification strips away the richness of linguistic meaning and reduces it to something mechanical, missing the intrinsic expressiveness of language. Quote 46. Modesty, in relation to meaning, is the denial that we can hope to give an account of the concepts expressible by the primitive vocabulary of a language. This quote defines modesty as the philosophical position that it is impossible to fully explain the concepts underlying the most basic terms of a language, Instead, it accepts that some concepts are fundamental and cannot be broken down further. This stance acknowledges limits to what can be explicitly defined in language, emphasizing that there are elements of meaning that may not be fully captured through analysis. Quote 47. Now, to embrace modesty is to hold that this is not a matter of shirking a task that it would be sensible to undertake. Rather, the lack of ambition is dictated by the nature of the case. This statement argues that accepting modesty is not an evasion of intellectual responsibility, but rather a recognition of the inherent limits of language. The decision to refrain from trying to explain every concept is not a failure to strive for deeper understanding, but an acknowledgement that certain concepts are, by their nature, unanalyzable or primitive. Quote 48. A meaning theory for a language must describe the practice of using words in it, which is what is mastered by someone who has a mastery of the language, without employing terms like express the thought that. This quote reflects Dummett's view that a proper theory of meaning should focus on describing the practice of using language, without relying on expressing a thought. Dummett believes that meaning should be explained through observable practices and behaviors, avoiding more conceptual or introspective descriptions that rely on the internal workings of thought. Quote 49. Dummett's conviction is that a properly illuminating account of a language must describe what is in fact a practice of thought expression, but in other terms. Here, Dummett's view is emphasized. He insists that a theory of language must describe how people express thoughts through language, but without directly using the terminology of thought or content. Instead, the theory must find another way to explain how language functions in expressing meaning, through a detailed description of linguistic practices. Quote 50. We make rational sense of ourselves and others as saying that, asking whether, and so forth. Dummett envisages an account of the practice of speaking a language that avoids such terms, but somehow duplicates their potential for making sense of behavior. This statement points out that we typically understand language use by recognizing the actions behind it, such as stating or asking something. Dummett's theory aims to avoid using these terms, yet still hopes to explain linguistic behavior in a way that retains this kind of intelligibility. The challenge is in describing linguistic acts without using the usual vocabulary that captures their rational sense. Quote 51. The only point at which a meaning theory need directly engage with linguistic practice is in the statements it yields about what can be done with whole utterances. This quote highlights that a theory of meaning should focus on how entire sentences or utterances are used in communication, rather than dissecting individual words or phrases. The theory's primary concern is to explain what complete expressions can achieve in context, reflecting how speakers use language as a whole, rather than focusing on its internal structure. Quote 52. Understanding a language is a capacity to see linguistic performances in it as intentional under such descriptions, and to make one's own linguistic performances intelligible in that way to others. This emphasizes that language comprehension involves recognizing the intentional actions behind speech. It means understanding what people aim to communicate and making one's own speech understandable in similar terms. The ability to interpret and produce language is thus a shared, rational process, where meaning is clear to those who know the language. Quote 53. It seems harder to be confident that an immodest meaning theory can do justice to the fact that the use of language is a conscious rational activity. This quote expresses doubt about more ambitious, immodest theories of meaning, suggesting that they may fail to account for the fact that language use is an inherently rational and deliberate activity. A modest theory, which sticks closer to how people actually use and understand language in practice, may better reflect the rational nature of linguistic behavior. Quote 54. Dummett insists that if a classical logician and an intuitionist are trying to come to mutual understanding, it is entirely fruitless to take the truth tables as common ground and the principle of bivalence as the point of divergence. This statement reflects Dummett's belief that classical and intuitionist logicians cannot simply rely on shared truth tables to resolve their differences, since their deeper disagreement over the principle of bivalence, whether every statement must be true or false, fundamentally affects how they interpret logic. It underscores the complexity of their philosophical divide. Quote 55. The wish for immodesty reflects a familiar philosophical attitude to content, where we take that capacity to be something we must find mysterious unless we can reconstruct it in conceptually independent terms. This quote points out that the desire for immodesty in theories of meaning comes from a tendency in philosophy to view language as mysterious unless it can be explained in abstract, independent terms. McDowell challenges this view, suggesting that a modest approach, which stays closer to actual linguistic practice, may be more appropriate for understanding meaning. Quote 56. Field's contention is that Tarski thereby misrepresented what he had done because of an erroneous belief that he had shown how truth, for formalized languages of finite order, can be interestingly defined without using prior semantic notions. This quote reflects Field's argument that Tarski mistakenly thought he had defined truth without relying on pre-existing semantic concepts. Field believes Tarski did not achieve a fully semantic-free definition of truth, as he still depended on basic semantic ideas, such as denotation and satisfaction, to build his theory. This contention challenges Tarski's claim to have made semantics more aligned with physicalism, a stance that Field questions. Quote 57. Physicalism requires something more, which Tarski did not offer, namely, explication of those primitive notions in physical terms. This statement underlines Field's belief that for Tarski's work to fully satisfy the demands of physicalism, the primitive semantic notions, like denotation and satisfaction, need to be explained in physical terms. Field argues that these semantic concepts to physical ones, Tarski's work falls short of the strict requirements of physicalism, despite its advances in formalizing truth. Quote 58. Field aptly describes the idea as being to treat free variables as temporary names, and, in place of satisfaction by a sequence, he speaks of truth relative to a sequence. This describes Field's interpretation of Tarski's treatment of free variables, comparing them to temporary names that depend on a sequence of values to determine their truth. Field emphasizes that truth in this context is not absolute, but relative to the values assigned in a sequence, a perspective that clarifies how Tarski's method handles variables in formalized languages. Quote 59. Field's reason for being unimpressed by a defense of T2 on the above lines comes out very clearly in his use of an analogy from chemistry. Here, Field critiques Tarski's second approach, T2, by comparing it to a pseudo-reduction in chemistry, where eliminating certain terms doesn't amount to a true scientific reduction. Field argues that Tarski's T2 approach, while eliminating some semantic vocabulary, does not offer a real reduction of semantic notions to physical concepts. It merely substitutes one semantic set for another without deeper physical explication. Quote 60. Given the chemical parallel, the vacuity of what is peculiar to T2, as against TL, seems undeniable. This emphasizes Field's conclusion that Tarski's T2 approach lacks real substance compared to T1, which acknowledges that it hasn't fully eliminated semantic notions. Field sees T2 as giving a false impression of reduction, arguing that the method still leaves unresolved the core issue of explaining semantic relations in physical terms. Quote 61. What Tarski in fact did, according to Field, was to show how truth, for those languages, can be characterized in terms of a small number of primitive semantic notions. Field argues that while Tarski's aim was to define truth without prior semantic concepts, what he truly achieved was defining truth using a minimal set of basic semantic notions, such as denotation and satisfaction. This means that even though Tarski's work was groundbreaking, it did not entirely escape the reliance on fundamental semantic ideas, which undermines Tarski's claim to having made semantics fully compatible with physicalism. Quote 62. Field's version of physicalism is this: the doctrine that chemical facts, biological facts, psychological facts, and semantical facts are all explicable, in principle, in terms of physical facts. Field believes that for physicalism to be fully realized, facts from various domains, including semantics, must be reducible to physical explanations. This quote emphasizes the demanding nature of Field's physicalism, which leaves no room for facts that cannot be explained in physical terms, posing a significant challenge for semantic theories like Tarski's, which retain non-physical semantic elements. Quote 63. The relations between language and extra-linguistic reality that a truth characterization describes hold in the first instance between simple expressions and things, and only mediately via the laws of semantic combination set out in the truth characterization between complex expressions and the world. This quote explains how a truth characterization in semantics connects language to the external world. First, it establishes relations between individual words and objects or things. Then, through rules of combination, how words are structured together, it extends those relations to full sentences. This layered approach reflects the complexity of how meaning is built from simpler semantic relations to represent reality. Quote 64. According to the thesis that I allowed at the end of the last paragraph, any instance of the denotation relation will have what we might call a physical realization. McDowell concedes that while semantic relations like denotation are not reducible to physical terms, each instance of denotation can still have a corresponding physical realization. This means that while semantic concepts may not be fully explained by physicalism, they are still rooted in physical occurrences, such as events where names correspond to physical objects. Quote 65. A doctrine with some claim to be called physicalism is this: all events are physical events, that is, have physical descriptions. Under their physical descriptions, all events are susceptible of total explanations of the kind paradigmatically afforded by physics in terms of physical laws and other physically described events. Here, McDowell outlines a more moderate version of physicalism, where all events can be described physically and are explainable by physical laws. This formulation contrasts with Field's stricter physicalism by allowing for the irreducibility of some semantic concepts, while still maintaining that physical events can be fully explained by physics. This perspective suggests a broader, more flexible understanding of physicalism, which may accommodate semantic and intentional phenomena without undermining the explanatory power of physics. Quote 66. With any given thing, e.g., theoietetus, one either knows it or not. This applies, in particular, to things that figure in one's judgments. This quote introduces a key aspect of Plato's puzzle in the Theaetetus, where Socrates suggests that, in making judgments, one must either know the object or not. This binary understanding of knowledge is central to Plato's argument, as it leads to the conclusion that false judgments should not be possible. The idea is that if someone knows a thing, they cannot confuse it with something else in their judgment, creating a paradox that Plato explores. Quote 67. It is impossible to judge that one thing is the other, whichever of these combinations obtains. Therefore, there can be no false judgments. Here, the argument concludes that if someone knows two things, they cannot mistakenly identify one with the other, thus ruling out the possibility of false judgments. This radical conclusion is based on the assumption that knowledge of an object ensures accurate identification, leading Plato to the paradoxical result that false judgments should not exist, a puzzling implication for the nature of knowledge and error. Quote 68. If something is to figure in one's judgments at all, then one must know it. This principle, central to Plato's argument, asserts that for anything to play a role in judgment, the individual must have knowledge of it. The assumption that knowledge is a prerequisite for judgment ties into the larger issue of whether one can make a false judgment about something they supposedly know. This principle sets up the paradox by implying that judgment without knowledge is impossible. Quote 69. The position is, essentially, that a true sentence of the form X is Y says that something is itself. Russell's perspective, as discussed in relation to Plato, suggests that any true statement of identity merely restates that something is identical with itself. This leads to a tautological understanding of identity statements, where to say X is Y is no different from saying X is X. This interpretation is key to understanding how Russell's views on identity mirror the problems Plato faces in grappling with the possibility of false judgments. Quote 70. To know the meanings of A and B is simply to know A and B. This quote emphasizes the argument that knowing the meaning of names, in this case A and B, is identical to knowing the objects they refer to. In the context of identity judgments, this raises the issue of how one could be mistaken in identifying A and B if one already knows them. The conclusion is that if one knows A and B, they should be able to discern whether A is B, thus making false identity judgments seemingly impossible. Quote 71. Frege held that the senses of sentences can be determined by giving truth conditions, and that the sense of a sentence constituent is its contribution to the senses of sentences in which it may occur. This quote reflects Frege's view that the meaning or sense of a sentence can be understood through its truth conditions, and that each part of the sentence contributes to the overall sense of the entire sentence. This suggests a compositional approach to meaning, where the meaning of smaller parts of language builds the meaning of larger expressions, an idea that has shaped much of contemporary philosophy of language. Quote 72. To specify the content of a saying, we need a sentence. This emphasizes the idea that to fully articulate the content or meaning of a statement, a sentence is required. It implies that the structure of a sentence is necessary for expressing thoughts or propositions, highlighting the centrality of sentence formation in understanding linguistic meaning and communication. Quote 73. Frege's notion of sense belongs with the notion of understanding, and we can get at what is involved in understanding a language by careful employment of the notion of knowledge. This connects Frege's concept of sense with understanding, suggesting that understanding language involves knowing something about the meanings or senses of words and sentences. The quote highlights the importance of knowledge, especially knowledge of truth, as a way of grasping the sense of language, a foundational idea in Frege's philosophy. Quote 74. The grammatical distinction between knowledge of things and knowledge of truths guarantees a difference of role for sense and reference. This quote explains a key distinction between sense and reference in Frege's philosophy. Knowing the reference of a word involves knowing the object it refers to, knowledge of things, while knowing the sense involves understanding the meaning or truth related to that word, knowledge of truths. This difference helps clarify the dual roles that words play in language, referring to objects and expressing meaning. Quote 75. How could someone possess knowledge sufficient to understand a sentence like, Hesperus is phosphorus, without thereby knowing already that the sentence is true? This addresses the famous puzzle about identity statements, such as, Hesperus is phosphorus. The challenge is how someone can understand the names involved without immediately knowing the sentence's truth. This puzzle touches on the complexity of meaning, sense, and reference, where two names refer to the same object, but can still convey different information based on how their senses are understood. Quote 76. Frege held that the sense of a name, if expressible otherwise than by the name itself, is expressible by a definite description. This quote presents Frege's view that the sense of a proper name can be articulated through definite descriptions, which carry meaning independently of whether the objects they refer to exist. Frege's position implies that a name can have meaning even without a real-world referent, as its sense is tied to the description it conveys, rather than the existence of its bearer. Quote 77. Opposition to this, on behalf of Frege, involves, I believe, a suspect conception of how thought relates to reality, and ultimately, a suspect conception of mind. This quote critiques Frege's position by suggesting that his view of how thought relates to the world is flawed, as it introduces a problematic separation between the mind and external reality. McDowell argues that Frege's theory posits an unnecessary indirection, implying that thoughts about objects are not directly related to those objects, but mediated by descriptions, which weakens the connection between thought and reality. Quote 78. When we mention an object in describing a thought, we are giving only an extrinsic characterization of the thought, but there must be an intrinsic characterization available. This statement challenges the idea that mentioning an object is sufficient to fully describe a thought. McDowell argues that Frege's conception of thought needs an intrinsic characterization, one that doesn't rely on external references, to truly capture the essence of what a thought is. This reflects McDowell's concern that Frege's reliance on external descriptions detracts from the true nature of thought. Quote 79. If God had looked into our minds, he would not have been able to see there whom we were speaking of. This quote, borrowed from Wittgenstein, captures a crucial point in the debate over the nature of thought. McDowell uses it to illustrate a critique of Frege's view, suggesting that simply examining a person's thoughts would not reveal the specific objects they are referring to. The quote underscores McDowell's argument that thoughts are not just internal descriptions, but are tied to real-world objects through the subject's interaction with them. Quote 80. A proper respect for a person's authority on his own thoughts points, anyway, in a quite different direction. This emphasizes the idea that individuals have an inherent authority over their own thoughts, implying that the meaning and reference of a name should be understood from the perspective of the speaker's intentions and interactions with the world. McDowell argues that rather than relying on abstract descriptions, we should respect the speaker's direct connection to their thoughts and the objects they reference. Quote 81. Frege and others have held that if one utters an atomic sentence containing a singular term that lacks a denotation, then one expresses neither a truth nor a falsehood. This quote reflects Frege's view that a sentence using a name without a referent does not yield either a true or false proposition. Instead, it falls into a category where it does not participate in truth conditions at all, leading to what is commonly known as a truth-value gap. This position is foundational in the philosophical exploration of language and reference, as it challenges the binary nature of truth. Quote 82. If we were to count a sentence of the form A is F false when the singular term lacks a denotation, then the two natural thoughts would commit us to counting the corresponding sentence of the form A is not F true. Here McDowell highlights the problem that arises if a sentence like A is F is considered false simply because the singular term lacks a reference. This would create the logical implication that its negation, A is not F, is true, which disrupts the conventional link between negation and truth value. This highlights a core issue in dealing with sentences that involve non-referential terms. Quote 83. The principle tertium non datur now takes this form. Vagueness and ambiguity aside, no assertion has neither a designated nor an undesignated truth value. This quote addresses the principle of the excluded middle, tertium non datur, and its reformulation in the context of truth-value gaps. McDowell suggests that any assertion, aside from those complicated by vagueness or ambiguity, must either have a truth value or a clear lack of one. This adaptation is essential in reconciling truth-value gaps with classical logical principles. Quote 84. Frege thought natural language confronted him with the possibility that a sentence might have a sense, but, since it lacked a Bedeutung, lack a semantic role. Frege's view, as explained here, involves the idea that a sentence can still have meaning, sense, even if it doesn't have a clear reference, Bedeutung. However, this lack of reference prevents the sentence from playing a full semantic role in asserting a truth or falsehood. This insight is central to Frege, particularly in discussions about the limitations of natural language in formal logic. Quote 85. According to the second justification, an utterance of the problematic kind, though it may masquerade as a move in the language game, in fact, simply fails to be what it purports to be. This quote suggests that when an utterance contains a term without a referent, it may appear to function normally in conversation or logic, but it ultimately fails to do so. The sentence pretends to be a meaningful statement within the language game, but it does not genuinely participate in the process of conveying truth due to its referential failure. This reflects a deeper understanding of how language can mislead through surface appearances. Quote 86. It is commonly believed that a Fregean philosophy of language and thought can represent an utterance or a propositional attitude as being about an object only by crediting it with a content that determines the object by specification, or at least in such a way that the content is available to be thought or expressed, whether the object exists or not. This quote highlights a widely held assumption in Fregean philosophy that utterances or thoughts about an object can only be represented by content that specifies the object. This belief implies that the content of the thought or utterance remains accessible whether or not the object actually exists. The quote sets up a key debate in philosophy about the nature of reference and how language relates to reality, especially in discussions of de re and de dicto thoughts. Quote 87. Frege himself is positively committed to de re senses for singular terms, and at least to some extent recognizes the commitment. This quote, referencing Gareth Evans' interpretation, argues that Frege acknowledges the existence of de re senses for singular terms, those that directly refer to objects. This recognition challenges the more restrictive interpretations of Fregean thought, which suggest that all references to objects must go through a descriptive sense, rather than allowing for direct reference to the object itself, in thought or language. Quote 88. Frege's idea is this: if one keeps track of a day as it recedes into the past, thinking of it successively as today, yesterday, the day before yesterday, and so on, that enables one to hold on to thoughts about it. Thoughts that preserve their identity through the necessary changes in how they might be expressed. This quote explains a dynamic aspect of Frege's view on how thoughts can retain their identity over time, even as the expressions used to refer to those thoughts change. It captures the idea that even though the linguistic description of an object may shift, for example from today to yesterday, the underlying thought remains constant, provided one keeps track of the object through these changes in time. Quote 89. Particular de re senses, each specific to its res, can be grouped into sorts. Different de re senses, modes of presentation, can present their different res in the same sort of way, for instance, by exploiting their perceptual presence. This quote explains that de re senses, senses that are directly about an object, can be categorized based on how they present their objects. Even though each de re sense refers to a specific object, different senses can present their objects in similar ways, such as through perception. This framework allows for a flexible understanding of how objects are presented in thought, without relying solely on descriptive senses. Quote 90. Frege's troubles about I cannot be blamed simply on the idea of special and primitive senses. They result, rather, from the assumption that communication must involve a sharing of thoughts between communicator and audience. This quote suggests that Frege's difficulties with the use of I in communication stem not from the concept of a special sense for the first-person perspective, but from his assumption that communication always involves sharing the exact same thoughts. The implication is that successful communication could occur without both speaker and listener sharing the same thought, as long as there is an appropriate correspondence between their thoughts. Quote 91. Russell's restriction results in effect from refusing to accept that there can be an illusion of understanding an apparently singular sentence or utterance, involving the illusion of entertaining a singular proposition expressed by it, when, since there is no suitably related object, there is no such proposition available to be entertained. This quote explains Russell's reluctance to acknowledge the possibility of illusory understanding. For Russell, if there is no real object to which a sentence refers, then no singular proposition is involved, and thus no understanding of such a proposition is possible. This refusal leads him to impose a restriction that limits the scope of singular propositions, which avoids cases where the speaker might mistakenly believe they are referring to an object when none exists. Quote 92. The real point about definite descriptions can then be this: although someone who understands a sentence or utterance in which a definite description occurs may be acquainted with the appropriate object, the way in which the description is constructed out of independently intelligible vocabulary makes it absurd to require acquaintance with an object. Here, the text addresses Russell's argument that understanding a definite description does not necessitate acquaintance with the object described. The sentence itself is constructed from terms that are intelligible on their own, meaning that one can understand the sentence without needing to know the actual object it refers to. This position is part of Russell's broader effort to distinguish definite descriptions from genuine referring expressions like proper names. Quote 93. There is no independent justification from general epistemology for refusing to allow that there can be illusions of entertaining singular propositions. This quote challenges Russell's restriction by arguing that there is no solid epistemological reason to reject the possibility of illusions in understanding. It suggests that people can indeed believe they are entertaining a singular thought about an object even when no such object exists. This idea contradicts Russell's insistence that genuine singular propositions require the existence of their reference and allows for a more flexible approach to object-dependent thought. Quote 94. Russell's conception of singular, object-dependent propositions is intended in part as a contribution. Propositional attitudes whose contents are singular propositions are meant to be recognized as a distinctive kind of configuration in psychological reality. This quote explains that Russell's idea of singular propositions, which are dependent on the existence of specific objects, has psychological implications. It suggests that certain mental states, such as thoughts or attitudes, have a unique structure because they are directly linked to external objects. This structure is seen as a key component of how the mind interacts with the world, and Russell's contribution lies in highlighting this distinct type of mental configuration. Quote 95. Why not say that some sentences or utterances of a given range express singular propositions, whereas others present the illusory appearance of doing so, rather than, with Russell, devising a kind of non-singular proposition to be associated with all alike? This quote challenges Russell's refusal to allow for illusions of singular propositions. It asks why we can't simply admit that some sentences genuinely express singular propositions while others only appear to do so, rather than, as Russell proposes, treating all such cases as involving non-singular propositions. This approach would allow for a more nuanced understanding of how language and thought relate to reality, acknowledging the possibility of mistaken reference without needing to restructure the underlying proposition. Quote 96. The insight is that there are propositions, or, as we can now put it, thoughts in Frege's sense, that are object-dependent. This quote expresses the shared insight between Frege and Russell that some propositions, or thoughts, rely on the existence of particular objects. These object-dependent thoughts cannot exist without the objects they refer to, tying the content of certain mental states directly to reality. This idea helps to bridge the gap between thought and the world by showing how specific thoughts depend on external entities for their content. Quote 97. But in another way it need not be very important, because we can understand Cartesian immaterialism as derivative rather than fundamental. the natural upshot of trying to satisfy the common impulse at a certain juncture in the history of science. This quote suggests that Descartes' immaterialism, or his belief in a non-physical realm of thought, may not be the most important aspect of his philosophy. Instead, it might be a byproduct of an intellectual effort to reconcile emerging scientific ideas with the nature of the mind. The focus here is on the broader historical context that shaped Cartesian thought, rather than viewing immaterialism as a core, necessary doctrine in itself. Quote 98. In the physicalistic modern version of the insistence on autonomy, the self-standingness of the inner realm suffices to exclude intrinsic involvement with the world, without any need for an appeal to phenomenology. This quote explains that in modern physicalist approaches to the mind, the idea that the mind is autonomous or self-contained excludes the possibility of it being inherently connected to the external world. This exclusion happens without considering phenomenological experiences, focusing instead on explaining mental states as internal mechanisms separate from their external relations. Quote 99. If introspection is to be distinguishable from knowledge at large, it cannot be allowed access to the external circumstances that partly determine the full composite truth about the mind, so its scope must be restricted to the internal component. This suggests that if introspection is to remain a distinct form of knowledge, it must be confined to exploring the internal aspects of the mind, excluding external factors. The restriction implies that introspection only gives us insight into internal mental states and not the broader external factors that influence those states, further reinforcing the separation between the inner and outer worlds. Quote 100. Quite generally, nothing could be recognizable as a characterization of the domain of subjectivity if it did not accord a special status to the perspective of the subject. This quote highlights the idea that any account of subjectivity must give special importance to the individual's perspective. Without acknowledging the subject's unique point of view, we would fail to capture what is essential about subjectivity: the personal, internal experience that is central to an individual's mental life. Quote 101. The difficulty is palpable. How can we be expected to acknowledge that our subjective way of being in the world is properly captured by this picture, when it portrays the domain of our subjectivity, our cognitive world, in such a way that, considered from its own point of view, that world has to be conceived as letting in no light from outside? This statement addresses a fundamental problem with some modern conceptions of the mind. If the inner realm of subjectivity is portrayed as isolated from the external world, then it becomes difficult to understand how our mental lives can be connected to reality. The mind, conceived this way, seems disconnected from the world it is supposed to represent, creating a philosophical dilemma reminiscent of Cartesian skepticism. Quote 102. The point of the conception of singular thought that I have been recommending is that it treats the Cartesian fear of loss in a different and fully satisfying way, not by trying to bridge a gulf between intentionality and objects, nor by a cavalier refusal to worry about the problem, but by fundamentally undermining the picture of mind that generates the Cartesian divide. This quote explains that McDowell's approach to singular thought offers a solution to the Cartesian fear of being disconnected from reality. Instead of attempting to bridge a gap between thought and objects or ignoring the issue, his approach challenges the very framework that creates this divide. By rethinking the way we view the mind and its relation to the world, McDowell seeks to dissolve the problem of disconnection altogether. Quote 103. In Frege's account, a mind is directed at a particular by virtue of grasping a thought that has as a constituent a sense of the appropriate kind, determining that object as its associated Bedeutung. This quote explains Frege's view of intentionality, where the mind is directed at an object by grasping a thought that includes a particular sense. This sense determines the object referred to, known as the Bedeutung, reference. Frege's model shows how language and thought relate to specific objects through senses that guide our understanding of what we are talking about, even when the object may not exist in the external world. Quote 104. Russell's thought was that the very possession of content, on the part of the relevant statements or mental states, ought not to be undermined if the speakers or thinkers were wrong in supposing appropriate objects to exist. This quote introduces Russell's perspective, emphasizing that mental states and statements should retain their content, even if the objects they refer to do not exist. This view contrasts with object-dependent theories, where the existence of an object is necessary for meaningful thought or reference. Russell's idea ensures that content remains intact, regardless of whether the objects being discussed are real or imaginary. Quote 105. Objections of this sort misfire, Searle argues, because they ignore the possibility of anchoring the particular directedness of the mental states in question to the particularity of the relevant experiences themselves. Here, Searle contends that criticisms of his view fail because they overlook how mental states can be directed at particular objects by linking to the specificity of the experiences themselves. This means that rather than relying on abstract descriptions, the direct experience of seeing or interacting with an object provides a solid foundation for intentionality, making it unnecessary to depend solely on descriptive content. Quote 106. There is no substitute for saying, "He is presented as that man," exploiting his perceived presence to make oneself understood. This emphasizes the role of direct perception in understanding and referring to objects. When a person points out an object in their field of vision, like that man, it relies on the shared perceptual experience between the speaker and listener. The object's presence is necessary for successful reference, and this perceptual mode of presentation cannot be replaced by abstract descriptions without losing its specificity. Quote 107. Searle's brain in a vat requirement dictates that one's visual experience when one sees, say, a station wagon is something that could have been exactly what it is, even if there had not been a station wagon in one's vicinity. This quote critiques Searle's idea that visual experiences could be identical whether or not the object they represent exists. It questions how visual experiences could constitute a direct relationship with the world if they remain unchanged in the absence of the perceived object. This challenges Searle's direct realism by suggesting that if visual experiences were the same regardless of reality, they would fail to offer a genuine connection to the external world. Quote 108. As Putnam memorably puts it, "Cut the pie any way you like. Meanings just ain't in the head." This quote highlights Putnam's famous assertion that meanings cannot be confined to mental states within the brain. According to Putnam, meanings depend not only on internal mental conditions, but also on external factors, such as the physical and social environments in which individuals use language. His claim challenges the traditional idea that meaning is something purely psychological or internal, suggesting instead that meaning is inherently linked to the external world. Quote 109. Meanings are in the mind, but, as the argument establishes, they cannot be in the head. Therefore, we ought to conclude, the mind is not in the head. This quote builds on Putnam's idea by suggesting that if meanings are partly determined by the environment, then the mind, which handles meanings, cannot be confined to the head. It implies that our mental lives extend beyond the brain and are influenced by our interactions with the world around us. This challenges the view of the mind as a self-contained entity, proposing instead that the mind is fundamentally connected to the external environment. Quote 110. According to this picture, then, there is a sense in which the mind is in the head. That is where the relevant states and occurrences are. But this picture does yield a sense in which we might say that the mind is, at least partly, not in the head. This statement reflects a dual perspective on the mind, acknowledging that while some mental processes occur in the brain, the mind's full functioning cannot be confined to this internal space. By linking mental states to interactions with the environment, the mind can be said to extend beyond the physical boundaries of the brain. This offers a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between internal cognitive processes and external realities. Quote 111. Mental life is an aspect of our lives, and the idea that it takes place in the mind can, and should, be detached from the idea that there is a part of us, whether material or immaterial, in which it takes place. Here, the text argues that mental life should not be confined to the idea of a physical or immaterial part of the body, such as the brain or an immaterial mind. Instead, mental life is an integral aspect of human existence, shaped by interactions with the environment and other people. This perspective rejects the notion that the mind is a separate organ, whether physical or non-physical, and instead suggests that mental life is distributed across our experiences and relationships. Quote 112. The psychological state of each, as it were, expands in accordance with the determination of the extensions of their terms, in a way that is compelled if we are to maintain both of the two assumptions. This quote illustrates how psychological states are shaped by the determination of meaning and reference in a given environment. It emphasizes that mental states are not purely internal, but expand to include how words and concepts are used within a specific context. The psychological state adjusts as meanings are influenced by the external world, supporting the argument that the mind is not confined to the head, but is shaped by broader linguistic and social factors. Quote 113. It is perfectly possible to insist that the psychological common property holds of each in virtue of his wide psychological state, rather than that the wide state is constituted by the common property, together with facts about how each is embedded in his environment. This quote emphasizes that the shared psychological states of individuals in different environments can be attributed to their wide psychological state, which includes their environmental interactions. This challenges the idea that the mental state is purely determined by internal factors. Instead, it allows for the external world to play a crucial role in defining the psychological state. Quote 114. Putnam does not seem to consider the possibility that his reflections about meaning might be brought to bear against the idea that the mind is the organ of psychological activity. This quote points out that Putnam overlooks the potential for his reflections on meaning to challenge the traditional notion of the mind as an organ responsible for psychological processes. McDowell suggests that if we take Putnam's insights seriously, they could lead us to reconsider how we conceptualize the mind and its functions, moving beyond a purely mechanistic or organ-like view of mental activity. Quote 115. The term mentalism has a perfectly good interpretation as a label for the view that the mental is a genuine range of reality. We do not need to accept that the nature of reality is scientifically determined. This quote clarifies that mentalism can refer to the belief that mental phenomena are real and meaningful aspects of reality, without needing to rely on a scientifically reductionist view. It defends the validity of mental phenomena as part of the broader reality, opposing views that reduce the mind to merely physical processes or brain functions. Quote 116. Putnam's solid point cannot dislodge the possibility that thinking that one hears the sound of water dripping is a mental representation, in the sense of a mental representing that intrinsically represents what it represents. This quote supports the idea that mental representations are not merely symbols with meaning imposed externally, but can intrinsically represent what they stand for. McDowell argues that thoughts about the world are directly tied to what they represent, and that this representational quality is part of the mental occurrence itself, rather than being an external imposition of meaning. Quote 117. The possibility that goes missing in Putnam's argument could be described as the possibility of mental representing without representations. This quote identifies a key gap in Putnam's argument, suggesting that he overlooks the possibility of mental processes that represent reality without relying on the traditional concept of representations, such as symbols or images. McDowell challenges Putnam's view, proposing that mental activities can be inherently representational without needing to be mediated by representations in the way that physical symbols function. Quote 118. A theory of meaning for a language should be a theoretical representation of the practical capacity that constitutes understanding it. This quote expresses the idea that a theory of meaning is meant to model the practical ability of language users to understand and use language effectively. It highlights the connection between theoretical linguistic models and the real-world skills that individuals demonstrate when they engage with language, suggesting that the theory should capture the nuances of linguistic competence in practice. Quote 119. An anti-realist insists that linguistic competence cannot involve a conception of sorts of circumstance other than those that a language learner had available to his consciousness in learning the language. This quote explains the anti-realist position, which holds that language competence is limited to what a speaker can experience or verify. Anti-realists reject the idea that language can refer to conditions or events that are beyond the learner's direct experience, placing limits on how truth and meaning can be understood within language. Quote 120. A realist who thinks he needs to appeal to a truth-value link in order to meet the anti-realist challenge shows, unless he is confused, that he pictures the truth conditions of the problematic sorts of sentence not merely as not being always accessible, but rather as being always inaccessible. This quote points out that a realist relying on truth-value links acknowledges that certain truth conditions are inherently inaccessible. It suggests that these conditions, such as those relating to the past or to others' experiences, cannot always be verified, yet they are still considered part of our understanding of meaning and truth, creating a gap between what can be known and what is real. Quote 121. The anti-realist's objection was that we cannot have a conception of a sort of state of affairs that is in principle inaccessible to us. This explains the central objection of anti-realism, which is the rejection of the idea that we can meaningfully talk about or understand states of affairs that are beyond our capacity to verify or access. Anti-realists argue that if something is inaccessible to human knowledge, it should not be included in our conception of truth or meaning, pushing back against realist claims of hidden realities. Quote 122. The realist, whom I distinguished, thinks of the circumstances, by contrast, as belonging to sorts that are sometimes available to consciousness, as they are on the occasions that constitute opportunities for training, but sometimes not. This quote contrasts two forms of realism, explaining that one type of realist believes that the truth conditions of certain statements, like those about the past or others' experiences, are sometimes available to awareness, but can also remain inaccessible at other times. This stance allows the realist to argue that even when truth conditions cannot be directly accessed, they still exist as part of reality and contribute to the meaning of statements. Quote 123. A truth-value link realist truth condition of another ascription of pain as something that is, in itself, inaccessible. That another person is in pain can be known, if at all, only by inference from circumstances that are accessible. This quote describes the realist position on ascribing mental states, such as pain, to others. The realist believes that we can only infer another person's pain based on observable behaviors, while the truth condition of their being in pain remains inaccessible. This creates a gap between what can be observed and what is actually true about the person's inner experience. Quote 124. The analog, in the case of the past, would be insistence that knowledge of the past occurrence of an event of a specified kind, say, is sometimes non-inferential. Here, the quote draws a parallel between knowledge of other people's mental states and knowledge of past events. It suggests that, just as we can sometimes directly perceive someone else's pain, we can also have non-inferential knowledge of past events. This challenges the idea that all knowledge of the past must be based on inference from present evidence, proposing that direct awareness of past events can sometimes be possible. Quote 125. A person whose nervous system contains one of the persisting effects, a trace of the impact of an event on a knowledge-acquiring capacity, is, potentially at least, in possession of knowledge that an event of the relevant sort has occurred. This quote suggests that the human nervous system may retain traces of past events, allowing for the possibility of possessing knowledge of those events. These traces enable a person to retain a connection to the past, even though they are no longer directly observing the event. This offers a physiological explanation for how we might have immediate knowledge of past occurrences. Quote 126. A theory of meaning in the style of our realist ascribes to a competent speaker, among other things, dispositions to respond to the obtaining of truth conditions, circumstances of sorts that need not be detectable, when they are detectable. This quote explains the realist's approach to meaning, in which a speaker is seen as having the ability to respond to truth conditions even when those conditions are not always detectable. It highlights the flexibility of linguistic competence, suggesting that people can understand and respond to meaning based on their grasp of truth conditions, whether or not those conditions are always directly observable. Quote 127. Anti-realism represents the past as unreal in itself, enjoying a sort of vicarious existence in its traces. This quote summarizes the anti-realist view of the past, which holds that the past has no independent reality. Instead, it exists only in the traces and evidence it leaves behind in the present. According to this view, the past is understood solely through its effects on the present, rather than being something we can know directly or conceive as having a reality of its own. Quote 128. For the purposes of this essay, realism is the thesis that a theory of meaning for a language can give a central role to the notion of conditions under which sentences are true, conceived as conditions that we are not, in general, capable of putting ourselves in a position to recognize whenever they obtain. This defines the form of realism being discussed, where meaning is tied to truth conditions that may not always be verifiable or accessible to speakers. It sets up the realist view that truth exists independently of whether we can know or verify it, a key point of contention in the realism versus anti-realism debate. Quote 129. A grasp of the condition under which the sentence is true may be said to be manifested by a mastery of the decision procedure. This quote explains that understanding a sentence's truth conditions is demonstrated when someone can reliably use a decision-making process to determine when the sentence is true or false. It suggests that comprehension is tied to the ability to apply these conditions practically, reinforcing the connection between meaning and use. Quote 130. It is, in fact, plain that the knowledge which is being ascribed to one who is said to understand the sentence is knowledge which transcends the capacity to manifest that knowledge by the way in which the sentence is used. This statement points out that understanding a sentence involves knowledge that goes beyond what can be directly observed in its use. It implies that linguistic competence includes an awareness of truth conditions that may not always be outwardly demonstrated, challenging the idea that meaning can be fully captured by observable behavior alone. Quote 131. The truth-conditional core does not purport to characterize an isolable prior psychological state, something from which one might progress to a command of what, in general, one is doing when one utters a sentence assertorically. This quote clarifies that the realist approach to truth conditions does not try to describe a separate psychological state that precedes language use. Instead, truth conditions are directly tied to what speakers are doing when they assert something, without needing to posit an underlying mental state. This helps avoid psychologism and keeps the focus on language as a public practice. Quote 132. We cannot, then, be content with a conception of meaning that makes it a mystery how those states can be knowledge, and consequently how there can be such a thing as understanding a language. This quote emphasizes the need for a clear, accessible understanding of meaning in language. It suggests that any theory of meaning must not obscure the connection between meaning and knowledge, and it insists that understanding a language should not be seen as mysterious or unknowable. Instead, meaning must be grounded in observable linguistic behavior, making it possible to understand how people comprehend each other. Quote 133. Realism is the thesis that a theory of meaning for a language can give a central role to the notion of conditions under which sentences are true, conceived as conditions that we are not, in general, capable of putting ourselves in a position to recognize whenever they obtain. This quote defines realism in the context of meaning and truth, explaining that a realist view holds that meaning is linked to truth conditions that exist independently of whether we can always verify or recognize them. This position asserts that even if we cannot directly access these conditions, they still play a fundamental role in understanding the meaning of sentences. Quote 134. When the sentence is one which is not in this way effectively decidable, the condition which must in general obtain for it to be true is not one which we are capable of recognizing whenever it obtains. This statement highlights the challenge of dealing with sentences whose truth conditions are undecidable or unverifiable. In these cases, the conditions for truth exist, but we cannot always recognize or confirm them. This complicates the idea of meaning being fully tied to use, as there are cases where understanding the meaning of a sentence requires acknowledging truth conditions that go beyond what is immediately observable. Quote 135. The theory of meaning cannot be a theory in which meaning is fully determined by use. This quote challenges the idea that meaning can be entirely reduced to language use. It argues that a theory of meaning must account for aspects of meaning that go beyond the practical use of language, such as the truth conditions of sentences that may not be directly verifiable or decidable in everyday situations. Quote 136. If we insist on eliminating dependence upon prior involvement in forms of life, then we eliminate the very possibility of understanding. This quote argues that understanding is inherently tied to involvement in a form of life, such as participation in language and culture. It suggests that by attempting to remove this involvement and view understanding from an external or detached perspective, such as the cosmic exile, we lose the ability to truly comprehend meaning. Understanding, therefore, depends on being immersed in the practices and forms of life that shape language and meaning. Quote 137. Goldbach conjectured that every even number greater than 2 is the sum of 2 primes. It might be claimed that if this conjecture is false, we could sooner or later ascertain that it is, by checking even numbers one by one until a counterexample appears. This quote presents Goldbach's conjecture and suggests that, if it were false, a counterexample would eventually be found through empirical checking. However, it emphasizes the lack of a definitive procedure for either proving or disproving the conjecture, highlighting the challenge of determining mathematical truth through exhaustive testing alone. Quote 138. The trouble is that this leaves it a mystery how one person can know another person's meaning. This statement touches on a key issue with the Platonist view. If meaning is tied to truth conditions that may not be fully displayable in linguistic behavior, it becomes unclear how people can share or understand each other's meanings. This points to a communication gap that arises when meaning is thought to extend beyond what can be explicitly shown or proven through language. Quote 139. Dummett's conclusion is that, on pain of representing meaning as transcending use, accounts of meaning in general, outside mathematics as well as within it, must characterize understanding in terms of propensities to respond appropriately to kinds of circumstance that can be ascertained to obtain whenever they obtain. Dummett argues that meaning must not go beyond what can be observed and demonstrated through use. This means that understanding language should be tied to our ability to respond to concrete circumstances that are verifiable. He generalizes this from mathematics to other areas of discourse, suggesting that all meaning should be grounded in observable facts, rejecting any notion of meaning that transcends practical use. Quote 140. It becomes impossible to suppose that our understanding of our language impinges on a reality that is determinate beyond our possible access to it. This quote encapsulates the anti-realist position that our understanding of language cannot refer to a reality that exists independently of our ability to access or verify it. Meaning, from this perspective, must be connected to what we can know and confirm, rather than referring to a reality that lies beyond human comprehension or verification. Quote 141. What defines realism, we can say, is the claim that in understanding our language, we can contemplate in thought a reality that is determinate beyond our access to it. This quote presents the realist view that language allows us to think about a reality that exists independently of whether we can fully access or verify it. In other words, realism holds that there are truths and facts that remain true even if we are not able to prove or experience them directly. Quote 142. The Platonist credits himself with a conception of what it would be for Goldbach's conjecture to be true that can be detached from any possibility, even in principle, that we might discover a proof. This quote critiques the Platonist perspective by explaining that the Platonist believes mathematical truths, such as Goldbach's conjecture, exist independently of our ability to prove them. The critique focuses on how Platonism separates truth from the practical capacity to demonstrate or verify it, suggesting that this detachment raises questions about the nature of mathematical knowledge. Quote 143. A realist, in the relevant sense, need not go beyond rejecting the distinctive thesis of anti-realism, the thesis that an account of how understanding connects with the world must restrict itself to decidable circumstances. This quote discusses how a realist can oppose anti-realism without fully endorsing Platonism. The realist rejects the anti-realist view that meaning and understanding must be tied only to what can be decisively verified. Instead, the realist maintains that understanding can refer to situations that are not fully decidable or accessible, allowing for a broader connection between language and the world. Quote 144. There is no need for an opponent of generalized anti-realism to volunteer a quasi-Platonistic positive view, to the effect that we can know what it would be for some utterance to be true even though verification or less than conclusive evidence is not even in principle available. Here, the text emphasizes that rejecting anti-realism does not require embracing a full-fledged Platonist stance. A realist can avoid the idea that we must have a complete understanding of truth conditions without needing to always verify them. This middle ground allows the realist to acknowledge uncertainty without fully committing to Platonism's extreme detachment from verification. Quote 145. It is widely believed that in his later work, Wittgenstein introduced a special use of the notion of a criterion. In this proprietary use, criteria are supposed to be a kind of evidence. This quote explains that Wittgenstein's notion of criteria in his later philosophy is often interpreted as a special kind of evidence distinct from empirical evidence. These criteria are not purely empirical, but are instead seen as part of the conventions or grammar of language. This interpretation suggests that the criteria provide defeasible support for certain claims, meaning that the claims can be rejected if new information arises, even though the criteria were initially met. Quote 146. What is important about this passage is not the issue it raises about the formulation of M-realism, but rather its account of the criterial alternative. Here the text focuses on the criterial view, which contrasts with M-realism. In the criterial view, the satisfaction of criteria for a claim does not necessarily involve directly perceiving the inner state in question, such as someone's pain. Instead, criteria provide defeasible evidence, meaning the claim could still be false even if the criteria appear to be satisfied. This approach challenges the idea that one can directly know another's inner state based solely on observable behavior. Quote 147. The reach of one's experience falls short of that circumstance itself, not just in the sense that the person's being in the inner state is not itself embraced within the scope of one's consciousness, but in the sense that what is available to one's experience is something compatible with the person's not being in the inner state at all. This quote highlights the limitations of the criterial view, explaining that even when criteria for someone's inner state are satisfied, the experience does not guarantee that the person is actually in that state. The idea is that the observable evidence, such as behavior, might not be enough to confirm the truth of the inner state, as the criteria could be satisfied even if the claim is false. Quote 148. Experiencing the satisfaction of criteria is meant to be not what constitutes knowing that things are thus and so, but rather a criterion for the claim to know it. This statement clarifies that in the criterial view, experiencing the satisfaction of criteria does not constitute direct knowledge of a fact. Instead, it provides a basis for claiming knowledge. But this knowledge can be overturned if the criteria are later shown to be misleading or incomplete. The criteria serve as a defeasible justification for making a claim, not as conclusive evidence of truth. Quote 149. The fact that criteria are defeasible can be prevented from compelling that admission, in which case we can conclude, by contraposition, that experiencing the satisfaction of criteria cannot legitimize a claim of knowledge. This quote critiques the idea that satisfying criteria can provide legitimate knowledge. Since criteria are defeasible, meaning they can lead to false conclusions, relying on them cannot guarantee true knowledge. The argument is that if a claim based on criteria can later be proven false, then such criteria cannot serve as a sufficient basis for claiming to know something. Quote 150. Judgments about other minds are, as a class, epistemologically problematic. Judgments about behavior and bodily characteristics are, as a class, not epistemologically problematic. This quote addresses the philosophical challenge of understanding other minds, highlighting that while we can easily observe and judge behaviors and bodily characteristics, our judgments about other people's mental states are more difficult and problematic. The distinction lies in the fact that while we can directly perceive physical actions, we cannot directly access another person's inner experiences, making knowledge of other minds more uncertain. Quote 151. The skeptic is right to insist that our best warrant for a psychological judgment about another person is defeasible evidence constituted by his behavior and bodily circumstances. This statement acknowledges that the skeptic correctly points out that our judgments about another person's mental state, such as their pain or emotions, are based on observable behaviors, which can be misleading. Since behaviors can be feigned or misinterpreted, the evidence we rely on is defeasible. It can be overturned by further information. This makes it difficult to claim certainty about another person's inner experience, based solely on outward behavior. Quote 152. Wittgenstein's response to the skeptic is to restore the concept of a human being to its proper place, not as something laboriously reconstituted out of the fragments to which the skeptic reduces it, by a subtle epistemological and metaphysical construction, but as a seamless whole. This quote explains Wittgenstein's response to skepticism about other minds. He rejects the idea that understanding others must be constructed from separate pieces of observable behavior and mental states. Instead, Wittgenstein suggests that we should view human beings as complete, unified entities, where behavior and mental states are not separate, but integrated parts of our experience of others. This view challenges the skeptical approach that divides the mind and body. Quote 153. If experiencing the satisfaction of criteria does legitimize, criterially, a claim to know that things are thus, and so it cannot also be legitimate to admit that the position is one in which, for all one knows, things may be otherwise. This quote critiques the idea that experiencing criteria, such as behavior, can provide valid grounds for knowledge, while also admitting the possibility that the claim might be false. If the satisfaction of criteria leads to a legitimate knowledge claim, then it should not be possible to say, "For all I know, things could be different." This reveals a tension in how criteria-based knowledge is treated in the criterial view. Quote 154. The highest common factor conception of experience is not entitled to the idea that makes the case unproblematic. It would be wrong to suppose that the highest common factor conception can capture in its own terms the intuition I express when I say that the fact itself can be manifest to experience. This quote critiques the highest common factor view of experience, which suggests that our experiences in deceptive and non-deceptive situations share a common core. McDowell argues that this view cannot adequately explain how, in non-deceptive cases, the fact itself is directly present in our experience. He insists that this direct openness to reality is crucial and cannot be reduced to an experience that is compatible with both truth and illusion. Quote 155. The deformation is an interiorization of the space of reasons, a withdrawal of it from the external world. This quote discusses how certain epistemological views distort the concept of knowledge by isolating the space of reasons, the realm of justification and understanding, from the external world. The withdrawal suggests that reasons and justifications become detached from the reality they are supposed to engage with, leading to a purely internal, self-contained view of knowledge that lacks a meaningful connection to the world. Quote 156. Seeing that things are thus, and so is a position that one cannot be in if things are not thus and so. This quote highlights a key point about perceptual knowledge. For someone to see that something is true, it must actually be true. The statement emphasizes the factivity of certain epistemic positions, such as seeing or knowing, where the correctness of the belief is tied to the external world. If things are not as they appear, then the claim to knowledge is undermined. Quote 157. A satisfactory standing in the space of reasons is a necessary condition for knowledge. But since the positions one can reach by blameless moves in the space of reasons are not factive, a satisfactory standing in the space of reasons cannot be what knowledge is. This quote explains a problem with relying solely on reasoning or justification for knowledge. While it is necessary to have a good standing in the space of reasons, i.e., to have justified beliefs, this alone is not enough for knowledge. Justified beliefs can still be wrong, and thus the concept of knowledge requires more than just proper reasoning. It also requires truth, which lies beyond the mere internal coherence of reasons. Quote 158. The reason why the extra stipulation that the belief is true, what is distinctive of the hybrid approach, is needed, is that likelihood of truth is the best that the space of reasons yields. This quote points out that the space of reasons by itself can only give us a likelihood of truth, not a guarantee. To turn a justified belief into knowledge, an extra condition is needed. The belief must actually be true. This underscores the gap between justification, which happens within the space of reasons, and truth, which must correspond to the external world. Quote 159. A good simple answer is that mere truth in a belief leaves it open that the believer has hold of the truth by accident, and knowledge excludes that. This quote distinguishes between true belief and knowledge by emphasizing that knowledge cannot be accidental. A person can believe something true by chance, but for it to count as knowledge, the belief must be justified in a way that excludes mere luck. Knowledge requires a deeper connection between belief and truth than simple coincidence. Quote 160. Knowledge of the external world cannot be completely constituted by standings in the space of reasons. The hybrid view concedes that such knowledge is partly a matter of luck, in the relevant sense, something outside the control of reason. This quote explains that knowledge about the external world cannot be entirely based on our internal reasoning and justification, what McDowell calls standings in the space of reasons. Some element of luck or reliance on external factors, things outside our rational control, must also be involved in knowing the world. This introduces the idea that while reason plays a significant role in knowledge, it cannot eliminate the dependence on the external world for true knowledge. Quote 161. To avoid fantasy, we would need to see our way to accepting that we cannot eliminate what the interiorized conception of reason conceives as a quite alien factor, the kindness of the world, as a contributor to our coming to occupy epistemically satisfactory positions in the space of reasons. Here, McDowell argues against the fantasy of thinking that reason alone, without help from the world, can provide knowledge. He emphasizes that we must acknowledge the role of the external world, what he calls the kindness of the world, in allowing us to reach justified, epistemically satisfactory positions. This means accepting that reason is not fully self-sufficient in the pursuit of knowledge. Quote 162. Her coming to have an epistemically satisfactory standing in the space of reasons is not what the interiorized conception would require for it to count as her own unaided achievement. This quote suggests that achieving knowledge, or a satisfactory epistemic standing, is not something that can be accomplished solely through one's internal rational processes. It critiques the idea that knowing can be entirely an unaided achievement by pointing out that the world's cooperation, reality conforming to one's beliefs, is necessary for true knowledge. Quote 163. The very idea of reason as having a sphere of operation within which it is capable of ensuring, without being beholden to the world, that one's postures are all right, has the look of a fantasy, something we spin to console ourselves for the palpable limits on our powers. McDowell critiques the notion that reason alone can ensure correct beliefs, describing it as a fantasy. He argues that this belief ignores the limits of human rational capacities and falsely assumes that reasoning can function independently of the external world. This passage challenges the overconfidence placed in rationalism and highlights the importance of external reality in shaping our beliefs. Quote 164. If moves in the space of reasons are not allowed to start from facts, riskily accepted as such, on the basis of such direct modes of cognitive contact with them as perception and memory, then it becomes unintelligible how our picture can be a picture of a space whose positions are connected by relations reason can exploit. This statement emphasizes the necessity of basing reasoning and justification on facts derived from direct cognitive contact with the world, such as through perception and memory. If we isolate reason from these factual starting points, the coherence of our reasoning becomes unintelligible, as there would be no solid foundation for reasoning to work from. This further highlights the importance of external reality in constructing a meaningful and intelligible epistemology. Quote 165. The conception I want to question can be put like this. If an epistemically satisfactory standing in the space of reasons with respect to a proposition is mediated rather than immediate, that means the standing is constituted by the cogency of an argument that is at its occupant's disposal, with the proposition in question as conclusion. Here, McDowell challenges the idea that all knowledge must come from an explicit argument or logical reasoning process. He questions the assumption that for a belief to be justified and considered knowledge, there must always be a solid argument that leads to the conclusion. This critique sets the stage for exploring forms of knowledge that do not rely on rigorous argumentation. Quote 166. It is a truism that one cannot see that things are thus, and so unless things are indeed thus and so. And a truism should be neutral between different epistemological positions. This quote emphasizes a basic truth about perception. One can only see or know something if it actually corresponds to reality. McDowell uses this as a starting point to bridge different epistemological views, suggesting that while perceptions must align with reality to count as knowledge, this should be a neutral point across various theories of knowledge. Quote 167. If a knowledgeable speaker gives intelligible expression to his knowledge, it may become available at second hand to those who understand what he says. This quote explains how testimony works in knowledge acquisition. A person who has knowledge can express it in a way that others, through understanding the language, can access that knowledge second-hand. This highlights the social and communicative aspect of knowledge transfer, where understanding and communication allow knowledge to spread beyond direct experience. Quote 168. A subject who follows that policy can be sure that there will be a period between Churchill's death and the next news bulletin, when following it will produce claims to knowledge that are definitely false. This quote addresses the uncertainty inherent in retained knowledge. The example of Churchill's death demonstrates that between moments of confirmation, such as news updates, someone might still claim to know something that is no longer true. McDowell explores how we continue to operate with knowledge claims, even though we recognize the possibility of being wrong in the interim. Quote 169. If someone hears a remark and understands it, or reads and understands a sentence in a book or a newspaper, he can thereby acquire knowledge. I mean that he can acquire knowledge at second hand about the topic of the remark or sentence. This quote highlights how knowledge can be acquired indirectly through testimony. By hearing or reading and understanding something, an individual can gain second-hand knowledge on the subject, even if they have no direct access to the information themselves. This shows how knowledge is not limited to direct experience, but can be transmitted through language and communication. Quote 170. The epistemic standing one can acquire in conversation is that of having heard from one's interlocutor that things are thus and so. This quote explains that in conversation, the knowledge one gains is based on hearing information from another person. The standing is mediated through the understanding and acceptance of what the speaker says, implying that acquiring knowledge from testimony depends on trust and comprehension of the speaker's words. 71. It is doxastically irresponsible to take it, between confirmations, that some state of affairs still obtains, even one of the right general kind, if one is in a position to know that its persistence is hanging by a thread. This quote emphasizes the concept of doxastic responsibility, which refers to the careful and responsible formation of beliefs. It explains that it is irresponsible to continue holding a belief about a state of affairs when one knows that the situation is precarious or subject to change, stressing the importance of regularly confirming beliefs in light of changing circumstances. Quote 172. A person sufficiently responsible to count as having achieved epistemic standing from someone else's words needs to be aware of how knowledge can be had from others and rationally responsive to considerations whose relevance that awareness embodies. This quote highlights that acquiring knowledge through testimony requires doxastic responsibility. To gain knowledge from others, one must not only trust their words, but also understand how knowledge transmission works and be aware of the potential risks involved in accepting testimony. Rational responsiveness to these considerations is necessary for the responsible acquisition of knowledge. Quote 173. If a knower gives intelligible expression to his knowledge, he puts it into the public domain, where it can be picked up by those who can understand the expression, as long as the opportunity is not closed to them, because it would be doxastically irresponsible to believe the speaker. This quote explains how knowledge becomes accessible in the public domain when someone expresses it clearly. Those who understand the expression can acquire the knowledge as long as it is reasonable and responsible to believe the speaker. It underscores that knowledge can be transferred through clear communication, provided the audience exercises responsible judgment in receiving the information. Meaning, Knowledge, and Reality by John McDowell highlights how our ability to comprehend and interact with the world is fundamentally rooted in the interplay between linguistic meaning, perception, and rational thought. Throughout these essays, McDowell defends a realist perspective that respects the role of human conceptual activity, while also acknowledging the objective features of reality. He aims to dissolve the perceived barriers between subjective experience and objective knowledge, arguing for a holistic view where our grasp of meaning is inseparable from our engagement with the world.
Curious to dive into the mind of John McDowell? With StudyLab Pro's book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of meaning, knowledge, and reality in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.